All right, this is the second lecture on this free will section in our discussion of metaphysics. And today we're going to be discussing free will and moral responsibility. Moral responsibility is, for the most part, one of the major reasons that the free will debate is important and interesting. And so this is kind of an interesting lecture insofar as it relates the metaphysical issues that we're thinking about now and the moral issues that we were thinking about in the first section of the course. So let's get in it. So, free will and determinism. Remember from this last lecture, we've got three different options here, right? Given the sort of arguments that we thought a little bit about, either determinism is true and there is no such thing as a free will. Everything is determined, from the previous states of the universe and the laws of nature, and so there is no free will in the end, even though it seems like there's one, like we have free will. Option B here. Determinism is true and free will is compatible with determinism. This is the compatibilist reply. The idea there is that, well, even if determinism is true, it doesn't mean that we don't have options, right? We don't have the ability to do otherwise in each day, each time. And so even though it seemed, even though in the end, given the laws of nature and the past state of the universe, even though we don't in the end have things would have gone the same. It doesn't mean that I don't currently have different options between me and I can't choose between those options. That's just what it is to have a free will. It's just to have the ability to do otherwise. Whereas determinism is this thing about the states of the universe, and those two things are compatible. Or there's option three, and option three is we I think ended on a little bit last time before talking about the paradox of free will. And option three says that determinism is false and that we actually do have free will. We've got libertarian free will. So interesting, move though from like, who cares really, right? Like, I mean, who cares if in the end we have free will or not? This set of arguments doesn't really affect my life, does it? Right? Whether or not determinism is true or compatibilism is true, or we have libertarian free will, does it really matter if we have free will anyway? Well, there's a problem if you think it doesn't, right? And the problem is moral responsibility. It seems like tied very closely to the nature of free will is the idea of whether or not we hold people morally responsible, right? So think about some act that someone does, right? So, like, I don't know, take a horrible car accident caused by a drunk driver in which someone is struck and killed. Now, in this case, car accidents happen all the time. Sometimes people die. Sometimes in drunk driving car accidents, people, get hit and die. And the car accident, sort of, it would have happened even if the person hadn't been drinking, right? However, it seems like in those cases, we tend to hold the person that was drinking and driving morally more responsible for what they did, right? We think of them as doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. And insofar as we think of them as having done something that they shouldn't have been doing, we think of them as having the choice to determine whether or not they were going to drink and drive, or not drink and then drive, or drink and not drive, right? And get a taxi. And because they had these choices before them and they chose the wrong one of the three there, that's what makes their action morally more reprehensible, morally more problematic. And so if this thing, moral responsibility, exists, and we think of people as being morally responsible only when they have these choices before them. I mean, like, if they didn't have a choice, if there was nothing, if someone was if they were drinking and then someone pulled a gun and was pointing it at their head and said drive, and then the accident happened, that'd be a totally different sort of situation, right? This person would be morally less responsible for having, for this accident because their life was being threatened. But in the case in which, it's a normal case of a drunk driving accident, it seems that the moral responsibility really does matter here. And so, but what really matters is the freedom. It seems like, right? Like we aren't going to hold someone morally responsible. We aren't going to blame someone or praise them for doing well if they had no other option or available, thing to choose from, right? Someone that does something morally great, right? If they had no way of stopping themselves from doing that thing, it just doesn't seem like, if they didn't care or they weren't thinking about it, they just did it on a whim. It doesn't seem like we're going to, morally praise them in the same way as we would someone that, worked really hard and thought about like, oh, well, I could do this, or I could take the easy way out, and then they end up doing the hard thing that ends up being morally great. So the problem here for free will really is this issue with moral responsibility. It seems like, we hold each other morally accountable. We think of each other as moral agents. We want to be able to say that people do good things and bad things, and we want to be able to say like why it is that some actions are good and some actions are bad, and why certain people should do, the right thing, why people should act in the right way. And it seems like moral responsibility is threatened if we don't have free will. That is, it seems like the very existence of moral responsibility becomes becomes a problem. All right, so here's the moral responsibility argument, right? It's an argument against the possibility of moral responsibility given determinism. So it starts: determinism is true. If determinism is true, then we have no free will. If we have no free will, then no one is responsible for their actions. So no one is responsible for their actions. Now, this seems like a very stark and almost terrifying argument, right? I mean, the idea that, Hitler actually wasn't a bad person because, he just had no control. He wasn't responsible for the Holocaust because he wasn't responsible for any of his actions. I mean, that sounds terrible, right? I mean, so many, all the other people, right? There clearly have been like horrendous serial killers, people that are psychopaths that understand that what they're doing is wrong, and yet go about the act like they continue to do it. And it's not that like there are some people that sure they have no impulse control, their brains are miswired, things are funny with them, and so in those cases it's different here. We're talking about people that are fully responsible for their actions, people that are just or, I don't know, these people that get caught in like Ponzi schemes or different kinds of scams. They know that what they're doing is wrong. They know that what they're doing is taking advantage of other people, and yet they do it. They choose to do it because they're like, ha, I'm going to get ahead. They're selfish, or they're being, in some way morally reprehensible. But according to this argument, given the truth of determinism, they're not responsible for their actions. I mean, if you take this argument seriously and you think, oh, this is true, then like it's funny to me that you're in this class because your actions don't matter morally in the end. And so why aren't you out there, just trying to scam people to get ahead? Why are you, taking a class? Why are you listening to this lecture right now instead of just cheating your way through the class, right? All right, so taking the moral responsibility argument seriously, the argument is valid, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows and is true as well. So if you don't like this argument, if you think, look, it's clearly the case that people are morally responsible for their actions, then we've got to deny one of these premises. And so there's 3 premises that we can possibly deny. So we're going to go through each one. The first one you could deny is that determinism is true. This is basically to accept the libertarian free will position. If you say, nope, determinism's false, there really isn't, it's not the case that the entire universe is determined in such a way that like the past states of the universe and the laws of nature fix how everything's going to go. There are also agents that exist in the world, like human beings or God or something like that. And we have the ability to change how things are. We have the ability to actually have effects in the world that are not determined from the time of the Big Bang. We have free will to do things. There are actions that generally the sort of move from here then is to explain moral responsibility along these lines, right? The idea is there we have the free will to do things, and then our actions are based on our character traits. And our characters, as a human being, my human character is built up out of character traits, and those character traits, help to guide our desires. Now, remember though, your desires and ultimately your character traits as well are outside of your control. Remember back to the first argument at the end of last or at the beginning of last time. Um, the desires that you have are ultimately, especially your base desires, right? Your core desires for like food and shelter and love and all those things, water. Those things are beyond your control. They're just desires that you have that you're evolutionarily kind of built into you. So those are beyond your control in a sense. But I mean, and so is your character, right? Your character is sort of the set of dispositions that you have to act in certain ways, and that set of dispositions is also beyond your control, right? What develops that is sort of how you're born and how you're raised and the people that you meet and whether or not they actually like train you into being a good person. And that's in the end, returns us to Aristotle's virtue ethics, which we talked a little bit about during the ethics section of the class. And I think it's sort of worth touching on here. So if you buy into the libertarian free will picture and you think, well, we do have moral responsibility and determinism's out, and that's in the end how this whole problem is going to get solved. Well, you're going to end up maybe saying something like this, because even though we have moral responsibility and determinism is false, it still seems like all of our actions are determined by our desires and we don't have control over our desires. So if maybe determinism is false, but we're still stuck with this like, kind of desire based problem with free will. We don't really have control over our desires or our characters. So it doesn't seem like we have like full ultimate free will, right? Like free will out of nothing. We just have this kind of like restricted kind of free will where our wills are determined or are part of our character. Our character guides our will and guides our desires, that helps us kind of decide what we're going to do. So Aristotle's idea is that ultimately, yes, you don't have full control over everything, but what you do have some control. You have control over your character in a sort of roundabout way. He thinks that what it is to be a good person is to work on your character, right? You've got to work on your character. You got to try to become, like a good person. You got to become courageous. You got to be courteous. You got to be generous. You got to be like, you got to not eat too much. You got to work out sometimes. Like he wants you to be a good, fully rounded person that lives a flourishing life. And in order to be one of those people, he thinks that you should try to emulate virtuous people that you see on the streets. You see someone that you're like, man, that guy's got it together. That girl's got it together. She really knows how to live life. She knows what matters. She knows, how to really, live a good life. And Aristotle thinks, yeah, try to emulate those people. And insofar as you can emulate those people, and come to recognize, how their characters work, and then work on your own character in that way, you'll become a virtuous person. Now, of course, you have to be lucky, but you do have some control, and the best way to sort of the control that you have in emulating someone or emulating a good character trait is when you see it, start trying to copy it, right? So just if you know what the good person would do in a situation, then do that yourself. And even if you hate doing it, eventually it'll become part of your life, and eventually it'll become easy and a good thing for you to do. All right, so that ends the basic idea of like, the idea of accepting the libertarian free will view, which rejects premise one. Now let's move on. So what about rejecting premise two? Rejecting premise two says that if determinism is true, then we have no free will. Well, suppose rejecting premise two, determinism is true, but we do have free will. That is, remember, this is a conditional statement, and to reject a conditional statement, you try to come up with a case in which the first part's true and the second part's false. So that would be, in this case, determinism being true, but you do have free will. Well, that's basically what compatibilism says. Compatibilism, remember, is the view that denies that determinism and free will are incompatible. It says, look, we can have free will because what free will is ultimately is just the ability to do otherwise. And even though determinism is true, right? The whole universe has been determined up to now. It's going to continue being determined. But that doesn't mean that I don't currently have the ability to do what I want to do, right? Like, all of nature up till now has determined everything. And up till now, it's continuing determining everything. And what I'm about to do is determined by the laws of nature and physics, and the physical state of the universe before now. But that doesn't mean that I currently don't have options, right? I mean, if I raise my left arm, because I wanted to, that was determined from the beginning of time that was going to happen. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't the result of me choosing to raise my left arm. And that's all that it matters, right? All that matters is that I have the ability to do otherwise. I could have left my left arm down. And that's what it means to be free, even though the whole universe and everything, all of time, is determined. So having the ability to do otherwise is all that we really need then to have moral responsibility. Even though, right, it was fully determined that, Joe Schmo was going to get in a drunk driving accident and accidentally kill, Jane Doe from the beginning of time, Joe Schmo still had the choice earlier that night to not drink or to get a taxi and drive and not drive home. Right? He had those choices. He could have chosen those things. And even though it was determined from the beginning of time that he was going to end up, drinking and driving that night, he did have the choice. And at that time, he took the wrong way. And so that's what, moral responsibility is just having the ability to do otherwise and not taking it. And that's why he's morally reprehensible. All right. Compatibilism, though, runs into some serious problems. Remember last time, right? Last time we talked a little bit about the consequence argument, and then there's this other problem, the ability frustrator examples, or they're called the Frankfurt style examples. And I'm going to talk about them here quickly. So remember, the consequence argument goes like this. It basically tries to show you that ultimately compatibilism is just out. It's like this like tricky view that it seems like, oh, maybe that sounds right. It's an interesting way of talking, but it's kind of, the consequence argument tries to show you, nope, that's a problem. It's a real problem, and it's not the case. The consequence argument says this: look, if determinism is true, then what you do is always a consequence of the laws of nature and the distant past, states of the distant past. You have no control over the laws of nature or the distant past. So if determinism is true, then what you do is always a consequence of things over which you have no control. Right? That is, if determinism is true, because that sets up the laws of nature, the distant past, and you have no control over those things, then you have everything that you do is a consequence over things that you have no control. So if what you do is a consequence of things over which you have no control, then you're never able to do otherwise. Really, in the end, you aren't actually able to do otherwise. So if determinism is true, then really you're not ever able to do otherwise. You don't have free will then. Right. I mean, so obviously, yeah, that's the idea. Is that in the end, whatever compatibilism says, you just end up not having the ability to do otherwise. And so you don't have free will. This argument is rough, I think, on the compatibilist. It is a very, very airtight seeming argument. I have no idea where you could possibly try to deny it, right? You definitely don't have control over the laws of nature of the distant past. I think maybe if you could build a time machine, but that's like a pretty outlandish scenario. That really doesn't seem like it's going to change a whole lot, right? So this argument's pretty strong. Given the consequence argument and the moral responsibility argument, it seems like we really need to be able to do otherwise in order to be morally responsible for our actions, right? We need to be able to choose between different possibilities. We need to be able to originate our own decisions to take one action over another action in order for our actions to actually be morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. Otherwise, it just seems like these actions are they're just sort of not even random. They're just like they couldn't have been otherwise, and so it just doesn't mean anything to say that someone did something bad or good, because they couldn't have done any better. It's just how things are. It's just like, imagine, all of morality is just fate, right? The fact that you did something bad is just how it was always going to be. The fact that you did something good was just how it was always going to be. Why does it matter then if we say, "Oh, good job," right? Like we should be telling people good job for the bad things that they do also, or not, right? We should be telling people bad job for the good things they do. It just doesn't matter, it seems, unless we have the ability to do otherwise. So it seems like we need to have multiple paths open to us, sort of things to choose from. And we need to choose, we need to be the origin of the choice of which path to take in order to really be responsible for taking that path. And this brings us actually to a further problem, and this further problem is kind of a wild, result. And that's the problem that actually, in the end, the ability to do otherwise isn't even enough for moral responsibility, right? The ability to do otherwise, like, it's not the case that you need to have, the ability to do otherwise. Suppose you don't have the ability to do otherwise. It seems like there are cases in which people don't have the ability to do otherwise, and yet they still seem morally responsible. And here's the case, right? So this throws a big wrench into the compatibilist reply, and it actually makes problems for free will, like general free will stuff too, but not as big. And here's what it is. These are ability frustrators, or Frankfurt style counterexamples. Imagine this scenario. So we've got Mary and Jones. And Jones Jones has a gun, and Jones is really angry with Smith. Right. And Mary knows that Jones is really angry with Smith, and Mary wants Smith dead. Now, what happens? Well, Mary is an evil scientist, and while Jones is sleeping, she implants an electrode in Jones's brain because she knows that Jones has got this gun and that he's going to go after Smith. And but she also kind of knows that Jones, is a sort of forgiving guy. He's the good guy in the movie here, and this is just a revenge movie, right? And in this case, it's possible that when Jones gets to the point at which he's pointing the gun at Smith, he might break down and end up not deciding to pull the trigger. So what's Mary doing? Well, she implants this electrode into Jones's brain, and this electrode is set up in just such a way that if Jones ends up not pulling the trigger, if he decides to not pull the trigger, the electrode's going to go off, and it's going to cause him to pull the trigger, shooting Smith, and thereby killing him. So in this case, the basic idea is that given Mary's implant into Jones's brain, Jones in the end doesn't have the ability to do otherwise when it comes to killing Smith. So in this case, Jones is going to kill Smith no matter what. He does not have the ability to do otherwise. But suppose this happens. Suppose it happens that, everything happens all the way up to that point, and Jones does, of his own volition, shoot Smith. He doesn't, in the end, the electrode doesn't go off. So he gets all the way up there, and he does shoot Smith. Question: is Jones morally responsible for killing Smith? It seems obvious, right? He's got to be, even though he didn't have the ability to do otherwise. He was going to, if he hadn't, he would have, right? If he had decided not to kill Smith, he still would have killed Smith. So he didn't have the ability to do otherwise. But it seems like at that point, if he had decided against killing Smith and then had still done it, he would have been less morally responsible. But in this case, we think he is morally responsible, even though he doesn't have the ability to do otherwise. So what gives? It seems like having the ability to do otherwise doesn't actually give you the, what you need in some sense for moral responsibility. It seems like even if you don't have the ability to do otherwise, you still may be morally responsible. And you might think like, well, wow, okay, why is that? Even if you don't have the ability to do otherwise, you still might be morally responsible. And I think something along the answer here might be something like, because we hold people accountable for trying to do the right or the wrong thing. Just having the intention to try and do the right or the wrong thing is enough for us to think, oh, that person's still morally responsible. Like, given the case, the fact that Smith is still trying to kill Jones, and and in this case, he does try to kill Jones of his own volition, from his own will. It's his own decision, and because of that decision, we hold him morally responsible. We can think about it sort of in the other way too, right? Imagine some opposite case where Mary implants an electrode in Jones' brain, such that if whenever he sees someone lose a wallet, he goes and returns it to them, right? So if he sees someone lose a wallet and he decides, I'm going to keep that wallet for myself, then the electrode causes him to return the wallet, right? In that case, it seems like, so imagine, Jones sees someone drop a wallet, and he's like, oh, and he goes and returns it, but the electrode never goes off. Question is Jones morally praiseworthy in this case? Well, yeah, it seems like he is. He did it of his own volition. If the electrode had gone off and he had gone and given it to the person, then he would be less praiseworthy in some sense, because he wouldn't be acting for the right reasons. So ultimately, it's not entirely clear to me why this is, or why moral responsibility doesn't require that we could have done otherwise. But in a sense, I think it's got to be this thing, and this relates back to Kant in a way, that being morally responsible has a lot to do, or being doing a morally good thing has a lot to do with whether or not you choose to do the thing on your own, right? You choose to do the thing because it's the right thing to do. All right, finally, there's this third premise that somebody could deny. This third premise says that if we have no free will, then no one is morally responsible for their actions. Maybe so in this case, remember, in order to deny a conditional premise, what you have to do is you have to set up a situation in which the first part's true and the second part's false. So in this case, what we would have to do is say, okay, nobody has free will, but they are morally responsible for their actions. So determinism is true and nobody has free will, but people are still morally responsible. So what's going to happen here? Well, okay, so maybe, and this is a stretch of a view, I think. Maybe even if we don't have free will, we're still morally responsible for our actions. Like, bare possibility, maybe being, determinism being true and free will being off the table, it's still the case somehow that there's moral responsibility. So it's hard, I think, to see how this could be, but maybe moral responsibility doesn't require what we may think of as real freedom, like the super intense kind of libertarian free will idea that, like, there's somehow these agents in the world that are the originators of their own actions, and that somehow foils how science works, right? Because we have no idea on the basis of science how it could be possible that there's that there's things other than the Big Bang, setting stuff off, and then the laws of nature affecting everything to have everything happen as it is today. We don't know how it's possible for agents to really cause things or events to just sort of spring out of nowhere in a causal way and cause things in the world without that, being caused by some previous thing in the past. So maybe moral responsibility and determinism, in this case, all it requires is that agents act through their character and aim at doing something like the right thing, this sort of Kantian idea. Maybe being morally responsible just requires that agents act on the basis of their character, even though their character in the end is fully determined on the basis of determinism, right? And they don't have any ability to have done otherwise. Determinism is true. They don't have the ability to do otherwise. But maybe in the end, that just has nothing to do with moral responsibility at all. Moral responsibility is just, even though you didn't have the ability to do otherwise, you act on the basis of your character and you aim to do the right thing. And so you're morally responsible if you don't do that. Now, if that's so, right, supposing that moral responsibility and determinism can go together, and we can have this view that you can still be morally responsible even if determinism is true, it seems like we should be much more lenient on this case in doling out punishment. And so this is an interesting point, and I think that it's an interesting if in the end you found yourself on this view, and you're like, well, okay, the argument for determinism seems true. The arguments against determinism are a little bit weak. I'm not sure I have free will. Well, suppose that nobody has free will. Like if you get to this point, well, if nobody has free will, but people are still morally responsible, it seems like we got to change how it is that we think of people when it comes to punishing them, when it comes to holding them responsible for their actions. They might still be morally responsible for their actions, but we shouldn't be punishing them as much as we should be rehabilitating them. So think about it this way. If no one has control over their actions or their characters or their desires, but we still recognize that in this world, there are certain good character traits, certain kinds of characters that are good, and they lead to good moral action in which people act in ways that allow everyone, including themselves, to flourish. Then really what we should be doing in this world is attempting to encourage those kinds of actions and those kinds of characters. And we should be trying to encourage people whose actions morally fail. That is, people whose actions don't live up to the things that cause flourishing for the rest of everyone, those things that don't cause flourishing for those individuals themselves. We should be encouraging those people to change their characters. Even though they, in the end, don't really have the ability to choose one way or the other, but we should be trying to help cause them to change their characters so that they can act in these ways that end up in line with the morally good stuff that cause flourishing in the world. It seems then, I think, to encourage people to develop their character, we should stop punishing people for wrongdoing. Because they had no choice. We come to realize that they have no freedom to act otherwise. They just ended up doing that thing on the basis of the character that they have, and that character is based on their character traits, their desires, and all of that stuff is not under their control. All of that stuff is determined given the earlier states of the universe and the laws of nature. So what we should do then instead of punishing people is we should start trying to help them to change. We should start trying to rehabilitate them, and we should start trying to get them into a place in which their actions conduce to the right actions and they have the right kinds of character, so that we don't then have to continue to try and help them change, right? Once we've helped them change to have the right character, they will take the right actions for themselves, in a sense, and they will just continue on as, functioning good members of society. Now, there is one problem with this final view, and in the end, if this final view really is problematic, then yeah, I don't know what to say. We've got to go back to one of the other two views, either compatibilism and figure out a way around those arguments, or free will, and then deal with the mystery of free will. And what's that? Well, the problem is that this view seems to condone what's called paternalism. And paternalism is the idea that we should restrict individuals' freedoms in their best interests. And so this question in the end is like whether or not the nanny state is really that bad. And the nanny state is this. The nanny state is like when a government or a group of people restrict individuals' freedoms and say, look, don't smoke, don't drink, don't talk that way, don't think that way, right? Don't wear those clothes. that in order to cause people to act in certain ways, that's in their own best interest, right? I mean, like, okay, so here's a really simple example. In Isla Vista, there used to not be fences along the bluffs in certain areas. And then students would get drunk and wander too close to the edge of the bluffs and fall and sometimes severely injure themselves or die. So people have now put up fences, and you can get in trouble for jumping over those fences if the right authority sees you. This is a function of the nanny state. They are trying to put these fences up in order to secure everyone's best interest, right? That, you're not supposed to be drinking and walking over there anyway, but if you do, this fence will hopefully keep you back and you'll get in trouble for jumping the fence. Well, in this case, is that really so bad? I mean, it's not that big of a restriction on everyone's freedoms, and so it just doesn't seem like it's that bad. But I mean, in the end, what this tells us is that because nobody has any real control over what they have, what they're going to do anyway. Well, we should just, we can insert ourselves in ways to actually force them to act in the right kinds of ways, so that it helps everyone flourish. And that seems, in this case, like, it seems like a violation of your free will, right? It seems like a violation of your rights. But in this case, like, I don't know, it's sort of, that feeling that you like, oh no, like we don't want all these rules and regulations. Well, the part of the problem is that, right, if you don't in the end actually have free will to begin with, what do rules and regulations matter? What do like they're not restricting anything. You're going to follow them or not follow them to begin with. So it's very unclear what to think about the nanny state, given the idea that determinism is true, but we still have something like moral responsibility. Finally, I'll recap the options, and this is sort of the end of this lecture, and the end of our discussion of free will. But yeah, it's worth sort of recapping and thinking about a little bit further about which option you think is correct, right? So suppose we've got the free will debate from last time, and then now this time we add in the moral responsibility argument. And if you the moral responsibility argument again states, let's go back to it, that determinism is, if determinism is true, then we have no free will. If we have no free will, then no one is morally responsible for their actions. Therefore, no one is morally responsible for their actions. Now, that ultimately gives us four options that we can take, right? Either free will exists and it's sort of a mystery, right? There's this libertarian free will thing, and it's totally mysterious exactly how it works in nature. But we have moral responsibility because we have free wills. And in the end, determinism is false. So this view rejects a certain claim, sort of scientific and metaphysical and philosophical claim about determinism. But it says in the end, actually, besides the Big Bang and the laws of nature, each individual has their own free will. They can do some of these things. They can make these choices, and that's why we can hold them morally responsible. The second option is to deny the second premise, right? So if you deny the second premise, then ultimately you say, actually, free will and determinism are compatible. But in order to actually take on this view, you're going to have to deal with the consequence argument and with the frustrator examples, both of which seem pretty difficult puzzles to deal with. I, as a philosopher that's been studying this stuff for a while, have no clue how you can deal with either of those examples. In the end, I just don't see it. So at least for me, some people think that this is a viable position, compatibilism. I cannot see or understand how compatibilism could be correct because of the consequence argument. It's just that difficult. So maybe 2 is out, but at least for me. 3, you could deny the third premise and you could accept determinism and say, hey, in the end, we don't have free will. However, we do have moral responsibility. It's just that moral responsibility is a little bit different than we thought. And insofar as we thought, that moral responsibility works one way and it actually works out this other way, that seems like it should have some serious effects on how it is that we treat people and how it is that we treat the way that people act in certain cases, right? Because in the end, they just didn't have certain choices, and so we should try and rehabilitate them in certain ways rather than punish them because they just didn't have those choices. Finally, if you don't like any of those, I think you're just going to end up having to accept the argument that determinism is true. And in the end, we just don't have moral responsibility. And that leaves us in a form of nihilism, which is a little bit scary, right? Those of you that accept this argument and think determinism is true and we don't have moral responsibility. You're the ones. I don't know why you made it to the end of this lecture. Why aren't you, out there doing whatever it takes to get ahead and have as much fun as you possibly can? Why are you in college right now, right? I mean, like, or why aren't you just cheating your way through college because maybe that's the way to get ahead? Or maybe you just didn't have a choice because everything's determined, and so it doesn't really matter in the end anyway. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. And next week, we'll be discussing the nature of time, maybe a little bit of space, and moving on in our thought process about metaphysics in general. Have a good rest of your week.